All right, and now it's official because we were told this meeting is being recorded, so let's move on. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Survive to Thrive, brought to you in partnership by the Boise State Venture College and Trailhead. I am Tiam Rastegar, and as usual, I'll be your host today. However, we decided to change things up a little bit here at Survive to Thrive. We've decided to invite other leaders in the community to join us and come on the show as hosts. And with that, today, instead of Nick Miller, I would like to welcome and thank the tireless Diane Bevan from the Idaho Women's Business Center for joining me as the co-host for today. Welcome, Diane.
Thank you. Thank you, Tiam.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us. February is Black History Month, and as such, in observance of Black History Month, we've decided to dedicate the month of February, as far as Survive to Thrive goes, to cover topics around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So call this our DE&I month at Survive to Thrive. We're kicking that series off with the so-called corporate perspective on DE&I. And for that, we are very fortunate to have Sharawn Connors as our speaker today. Sharawn is the VP of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Boise's very own Micron Technologies. So welcome to the show, Sharawn.
Thank you so much. It's fabulous to be here. I'm really excited to have this conversation today. DEI is extremely important and something that every company should be focused on. So I want to share all of the fantastic things we're doing at Micron and hopefully inspire others to continue to push for progress as well.
Yeah, wonderful. We look forward to dissecting that context, especially with your expertise at the table today. So just for our audience, in terms of context for the day, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick things off and create an environment where our audience can get to know Sharawn a little bit better and also understand a little bit more about how one becomes the VP of DE&I at a place like Micron. And then we're going to dive into some topics more contextual in general about DE&I. And then we're going to dive into what Micron is doing in terms of the initiatives around DE&I, and then we're going to try to take those initiatives and translate them maybe into actionable strategies or just tasks for early stage entrepreneurs and smaller businesses. So on that note, if I may, Sharawn, ask you to tell us a little bit about your personal and professional background and help our audience sort of trace how you became the VP of DE&I at Micron.
Yeah, so I would love to kick off by just sharing a little bit about me and my diversity dimension. So I am a Black woman. I was born and raised in Oakland, California. That's where I call home. And I was raised in a single parent household by my father. And he was very keen on education. He was college educated himself. And I call that out because so often in the media, we see portrayals of Black men as either criminals or drug dealers or thieves. And my father was none of those things. He was committed to his family, his children. He got up, he went to work every day, and he really instilled a passion for continuous learning and inspired my work ethic. He actually was the first person to teach me about leadership and told me, when he's not home, I'm in charge of the household. And so I carry so much of that with me today. And I was very fortunate that he was passionate about education. I grew up in East Oakland in a predominantly Black neighborhood, but I went to school in a different neighborhood. I went to school in the Oakland Hills and the majority of my classmates were white. And so that was a very different experience for me. But what I want to highlight that is important is the schools in my neighborhood would not have prepared me to be having this conversation with you all today. I would not be in this seat today. And fundamentally, I believe that that's a problem. Everyone deserves access to a quality education. Every child deserves access to technology, and everyone should be inspired to dream big. And I think that's one of the problems that we have today is we don't have that access for youth to see what is truly possible and what are the opportunities available to them. And I'm so proud that that's one of the things that we focus on at Micron is looking at, underrepresented groups and how do we expose them to what is possible for them in tech. And so that's really one of the things that drives me. Fast forward as I started my career in IT and then moved over to HR, I started to notice two very distinct things. And one is that as I continued to climb up the corporate ladder, there were less people in the room that looked like me. There were usually a few women. And I typically was the only Black person in the room, unless Sharon Johnson, who's on this call today, was in the room with me at one of my past employers. And while I certainly think that I'm an intelligent person and I know a lot about some things, I can guarantee you that there are many women that are much smarter than I am. There are many people in the Black community who have fantastic ideas as well. So why aren't they represented in the room? And so that quickly became to me an area that I wanted to make an improvement in. The other thing that I noticed as I was managing compensation is I started to see disparities in pay that weren't necessarily easily explained, right? So why is it that some are making more than others? And as I was managing comp, I myself started to learn things about compensation that I never knew. I didn't know a lot about how equity works. I didn't know you could get a spot bonus at a company if you do something amazing. I didn't understand the market value of a job. So when you know those things, you're able to negotiate and start from a place of knowledge. And I think that is something that we all should have access to that information. And so I'm very passionate about pay equity and ensuring that everyone is paid fairly for the work that they do. So that's kind of what drove me here. And I would say my lived experience as well as my professional experience is what's allowed me to sit in this seat. So when you say, how do you get to VP of DEI? There's many paths, right? There's many paths. For me, the skills that I had in my toolkit around HR practices and processes and compensation and benefits and being an IT project manager and understanding how to pull people together to focus on a common goal. I use all of that today, but I'm certain that anyone who has a passion for this work, there are tools in your toolkit that you can use as well to be in this seat. So that's a little bit about me and what drives me.
I love the story, and I'm going to obviously invite Diane to jump in here at any point, but there's two takeaways for me there. And thank you for sharing the story about, the root of your passion and the relationship with your dad. But I have to say, you had to leave your community to attain access to equal opportunity, i.e. education, i.e. knowledge that then empowered you and enabled you to be a self-advocate, right? To advocate on your own behalf. Like you said, if you don't know about spot bonuses and you don't understand compensation structures, how are you going to advocate for yourself? And so, you bring that up as a problem, the fact that, still today, folks have to leave their communities and go into other communities to attain an education. And I just want to say that, that's not available to everyone, the ability to go to another school, outside of your own community. So I just want to, again, thank you for sharing that story. I find it fascinating. Oftentimes, we just assume that, folks with big titles, went about it, the corporate ladder way, the professional way, went to Ivy League schools. But I'm always just intrigued to hear about the genesis of the passion and where that came from and how that leads people to forge their career paths.
Yeah, and thank you for calling out the Ivy League schools. I did not go to Ivy League school, and I really challenge some of the perceptions around that. So I do think that that is important, and we need that diversity dimension at Micron and at all companies, right? But we also need other things as well, right? So we need, for example, tenacity. That's one of our values, and that's something that I certainly learned growing up in Oakland. And I don't think you can get that out of any school, to be honest with you, right? But that's something that I lean on a daily basis. So I think we should be very open-minded around, what can we, who can we bring into our company that's really going to enhance our culture, and that's going to continue to push us to think about things differently. And to do that, you need a mix of people with a variety of backgrounds and a variety of educational backgrounds.
I think that's a great segue. You talk about the mix of people and a variety of backgrounds. Let's just go straight to the jugular here. What is DE&I? Is it about gender? Is it about race? Is it all of the above? Or am I completely missing the mark here?
Yeah, so thank you for that question, because that's top of mind for a lot of people. And what I often see is companies focus on gender. And I think that's a great place to start, right? If you're in a company, you're like, gosh, where am I going to start? That's certainly where Micron started. But as you move up the DEI maturity model, you really need to understand that there are many dimensions to diversity that are seen and unseen, right? And there's intersectionality as well. So I'm a woman, but I'm also a Black woman. And so for me, that's maybe a very different experience than a Latino woman in my company, or a white woman, right? But then if we want to look below the surface, there's many other diversity dimensions. So I would say everyone is diverse in some way, shape, or form. So I'll talk a little bit about one of my diversity dimensions that I didn't think would be as big of a part of my identity as it is today. And that's me as a caregiver. So my grandmother lives with me. She's 92 years old. She has dementia. She could walk in here at any minute and ask what day it is, and I'll be sure to answer. But what's interesting about that is that impacts how I show up at work, right? That's something that you all need to know about, because what it means is it impacts my flexibility, right? So 5 years ago, I could work through lunch, I could work in the evenings. Now I have someone I need to check in on and make sure that they've eaten. And I'm always considering that person with every move that I make. And it impacts, how I show up on this call. If Nana's asked me 20 times, what day it is, I might show up a little differently than if she's having a good day, right? And I share that with you all because we all have those different diversity dimensions that make up our identity. So when we talk about diversity at Micron, we are focused on underrepresented groups, right? Because we know we have opportunity there. And that's women globally, people with disabilities globally. In the US, that's Blacks, Latinx, and veterans. But beyond that, right, there is a whole spectrum of diversity that we want to tap into. And my job is to make sure that every single person at Micron feels seen, heard, valued, and respected. And so that is an end goal. And that's the same whether you're a white male or whether you are a Cuban woman. We want everyone to wake up on Monday morning and be excited about coming to Micron and know that they are valued and they are respected.
This is very mind-blowing, because I mean that I would have never considered caregiver being part of someone's DE&I dimension. And to kind of push that, to pull on that thread a little bit, you also said, white male. It tends to be, well, let me put it this way. I have conversations around DE&I, and when I talk to my friends that are white males, they tend to approach that subject a little defensively, because they automatically assume somehow this is pointed at them, right? You just categorically included them, right? So
absolutely.
is that what you're saying? Can a white male bring a diversity dimension to the table for a corporation?
Absolutely. So I think this is really interesting to touch on because that's one of the biggest DEI myths is that DEI is just for them, whoever them is, whether that's women, whether that's Blacks, right? But I will tell you, research has shown that 45% of white males are covering at work. That means they are masking a part of their identity or that diversity dimension. And my goal is to make sure that we're all able to bring our whole selves to work, right? So you don't have to hide that you are gay. You don't have to hide that you love rap music. You know what I mean? Whatever it is, come as you are. Right, that's not going to impact your performance. That's not going to impact your opportunity to advance, and we're going to make sure that you're paid fairly regardless of those different diversity dimensions. But absolutely, white men have a part to play in this as well, and they're also part of the solution. So we talk a lot at Micron about allyship, and I know Diane is a fantastic ally, and you'll hear more about how, you know, her journey and why that's so important. But they have a very strong role to play in this, and so we're actually talking about that at Micron this month for Black History Month. We're bringing in Tim Wise, who is an advocate for racial justice, and he's a white male, and he's going to talk specifically about the role that white men can play in this journey. So I encourage you all, if you're not familiar with him, to check him out.
You know, on that note, Diane, if you can share with us a little bit about the allyship element that Sharawn is pointing out. I know during the prep call, you shared a little bit more with us, but give us an insight into the work that the Idaho Women's Business Center is doing around allyship in the community.
Sure, thanks, Tiam. And I couldn't agree more. The allyship of being that voice for the underserved or for those that aren't necessarily getting a seat at the table is just as important of a role in DE&I. And, you know, I did share that when I first was asked to be the CEO of the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, I was the one that felt like I wasn't the right person. But then as I really embraced that role, realized that you just have to love people, all people, and you just want to, you know, you have to be able to empower those. And I love when she was talking about that diversity dimensions, because that is so true that, you know, and with the Women's Business Center, we absolutely put a primary focus on our underserved, but that means rural. That does mean women. That means, you know, the Hispanic community, but that also means the Bosnian community and the Asian community. And so our goal is to really serve all women and all cultures and communities. And we're seeing some huge miracles, but Sharawn made it really important. And I think both of you talked about that she had to leave to go be in those circles. I think I have a responsibility to be the inviter, to invite people to leave their communities and leave their safe spaces and to walk into the fear and realize that they do have a seat at the table, and we do want to empower them to become the leader that's inside them. And so I think that that's one of my biggest responsibilities, is to make sure that all women in Idaho know that they're invited and have a seat.
Yeah, to Sharawn's point, I think your role as a white woman, being a leader in the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, you know, that's an example of allyship right there. You take the responsibility to kind of drive change. And as both of you are talking, you know, something is emerging here. And Sharawn said something along the lines of, yes, at Micron, we started with gender, we started with race, because, you know, that's where we have opportunity. So that lens to look at DE&I as an opportunity is quite the paradigm shift, to be perfectly honest, when compared to the narrative around DE&I, especially in my immediate community. So let's talk a little bit about, does DE&I, this diversity of thought as we're kind of approaching it, does that come at the expense of performance? In other words, if I, as a business owner, decide that, you know, I care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, am I making trade-off decisions between bringing on certain people and then, you know, maybe being not as productive or not as profitable?
Yes, I think what you're talking about is a question that I hear often at Micron around, if we bring in diverse talent, are we lowering the bar? And every time I hear that, I almost cringe, um, because I know what it took for me to really grow in my career, and how I had to push up against a lot of different stereotypes, and how much extra effort I put in to make sure that I'm showing up in a way that's really going to promote bringing more Blacks, for example, into Micron. And so what I would tell you is, no, it doesn't mean that you are sacrificing on performance, but what it does mean is that you're going to have to maybe invest more time and effort into where you seek out talent. And so it's not about going to your neighbor or those in your immediate circles to say, hey, I have an opening. Are you interested? Do you know anybody? It's about casting the net a little bit wider, right? And thinking about, for your example, not just tier one universities, but what other universities are graduating, in our case, quality engineers that could add value in our company. So we're very clear that we don't sacrifice on quality. Our standards are our standards, but where we are looking for talent has changed, right? And so I think that's the conversation that we need to have. So there is good talent out there. Are you actively seeking talent? Are you tapping into that market? Is your criteria for who you're hiring, is it fair, or is there bias in it? Is it documented? Is every candidate having the same experience? That's something I'm very keen on, right? So we have candidate allies that sit on the interview panel to make sure that the experience that you have, Tiam, is the same experience that Diane has, right? Because we know we all have bias. So how do we mitigate this? But I think it's so important to call out, and I can't say this enough at Micron, our standards don't change. But now we have technology and we have tools so that we can source for talent in a different way. And we do measure, because I think what gets measured gets done. So we look at, what do our interview slates look like? Are they diverse? And where, to your point, do we have opportunity?
So you're really talking about, DE&I as quite the contrary, not a cost or a cost center. It's basically a competitive advantage.
It is, and there's a huge ROI on it. So we know that companies, for example, that have at least 30% of their senior leadership is female, have better performance. We know that that's been proven. We know that teams that are diverse make better decisions and they make them faster. And part of the reason for that is what you have now in that diversity of thought that you talked about earlier is you have healthy conflict, right? And you have perspectives that you may not have previously thought about, when not only everyone is in the room, and I want to be clear on this because having diverse team members is important, but if I'm in the room and I feel like I can't speak up or whatever I say is going to be shut down, you're missing out on that ROI. So the inclusion piece is very important as well, but it may cost a little bit more. So one of the conversations I have with my managers is, when you're seeking out diverse talent, typically at Micron, it takes us about 45, maybe 50 days to fill a opening, right? It may take you a little bit longer because you're seeking out different talent, right? And you want to make sure that you're not missing any key talent that could potentially be a great fit for your company. So you have to afford, you have to bake that into the process, but the ROI that you're going to get is going to really pay off in the end. And that's where we're focused.
You did just bring up the measurement of metrics. And so you also gave the example of a person accompanying an interviewee during the interview process. I took notes on both of those because it's quite surprising. I didn't think of that. But in terms of the metrics, this is interesting to me because I tend to preach that to early stage entrepreneurs that if you set goals, you're going to measure those. So make sure you're measuring the right thing. Because if you measure the wrong thing, you're going to perform towards the wrong metric. And so give us a sense of, earlier you raised pay equity, right? What other areas, and maybe you can also speak to pay equity a little bit more, but what other areas are low-hanging fruits in measuring the impact of DE&I?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I'll split it between diversity and inclusion. So let's talk about diversity first. Diversity is who you have in your organization. That's easy to measure, right? So if you're when people are applying, if you're collecting that data, you can see what your representation looks like. And what's nice about today is we have Google, and you can find lots of information on Google on what we call the talent addressable market. And what that means is what is the population look like for the type of talent that you're seeking, right? So the government pushes out that type of information. We know that LinkedIn Talent Insights, they provide information on what's available in the market. Universities provide information on who they're graduating. So you can take a look at, what do I have in my organization today versus what's available in the talent addressable market. And that's going to give you your gap. And maybe you're above, which is fantastic, right? We all want more of our fair share. Or maybe you're below and you say, aha, that is an opportunity for us. Maybe we can tap into more of this talent because now we know that they're here. And so that's one measurement I definitely would, if I was going to start somewhere, I would start with, what do we have today? And what do our communities look like, right? Because there's your opportunity. And now let's talk a little bit about, actually, let me double back down to diversity. You also want to, once you've done that, there's other areas you want to look at. Who are you promoting, right? Because there's bringing people in, but then you also want to retain your talent. So you want to look at, who are you promoting? Who are you giving stretch and rotational or global mobility assignments to, right? Who's on the succession plans? All of that is important because not only do you want to bring good talent in, but you want to keep them. And so as you begin to mature on your DEI model, you can move from talent acquisition to start working with your people development team to think about, how do we cultivate this talent so that it's represented all the way up in our organization. Now, let's talk about inclusion, because managers love to look at diversity, right? It's tangible, it's easy. Inclusion is how people feel, right? It's Monday morning. Am I feeling good about coming to Micron? When I get here, am I feeling respected? Do I feel like my team thinks I add value? Am I able to be myself and not mask that 45% of who I am? Can I talk about Nana and how crazy last night was, right? That's inclusion. So there's a few ways that companies can measure that. One of the best practices is to look at your engagement data. So if your company runs an engagement survey, you can put questions on there around inclusion, and voila, now you have a baseline. So you can measure that every 6 months or year over year and track your progress. So what we're hoping at Micron is we see on our inclusion index, those scores start to increase. And it could be as simple as, do you feel respected? Do you feel your team values differences of opinion? Do you feel you're able to share your diversity dimensions? Those are all great questions that you can measure year over year. So that's one way to measure inclusion. Another way that we look at inclusion is through education. So we know that everyone is on a journey when it comes to DEI, and not everyone is in the same place. So for example, at Micron, we offer 9 different inclusion ally trainings, and they're given by our employee resource groups from them. So it's a training, for example, from our Black employee resource group on how to be an ally to the Black community. Our Pride Plus ERG has a training on how to be an ally to the LGBTQ plus community. And being an ally means you know something about that community. So they're educating them on the appropriate terms and the challenges they face and how you can speak up against microaggressions. And so that's another way that we measure inclusion. So we are requiring all of our team members to take at least one of those 9 ally trainings. And so you can measure inclusion that way, but it's a lot harder, right? Another thing that we measure at Micron is participation in our employee resource groups, right? So is our membership growing? We look at our senior leadership. Are they attending meetings or events? All of that is going to give us a pulse on how our team members feel. And we also conduct focus groups as well, so that we can collect data and look for trends and opportunities. So those are some of the ways that we measure. But I heard someone say, and I agree with this, someone said to me, how do you measure the ROI on your mom? You know that she's important, right? You know she's hopefully done a lot for you in your lifetime. Put a number on that. You can't put a number on everything, right? So I just wanted to be clear. There are certainly things we can do, but we have to be okay with knowing that we're putting in this work, and we may not be able to give it a precise number, but we know that we're making progress.
So Sharawn, you bring up some really interesting topics as you dive into that. So let's kind of bring that into Idaho. So
Yeah.
Idaho is not, hasn't always been known as a very diverse state. We do know that that landscape is changing as a lot of people are moving here, but I also would argue that there's a lot of diversity here that's just not seen in the right circles or in the right seats. So I often have become seen as that bridge between the non-Hispanic and the Hispanic community in Idaho, which is our fastest growing population at the moment. And when I get those calls from different corporate and even small business saying, I really need to hire someone bilingual, or I really want to have diversity, but they're not really sure where to start. So obviously we love that Micron is such a great example in our state. And I think we're so fortunate to have them here. But for someone maybe that's on this call or is watching live, when it's that very first positive intentional step to bring in diversity into an organization or into a team or the intention is authentic and it's real to bring that in. But at the same time, they don't want to make the person they hired feel like they were hired because of the color of my skin, because I can speak a second language. So help us walk through what kind of a conversation would that look like on the employer side, and also to bring someone in to make them feel truly that they were chosen because they were the right person for the job and not because they were from an underserved population.
Yeah, so we get this question a lot at Micron, and I think communication, the power of communication, starting at the very top, is invaluable. So our CEO is very clear that we don't compromise on standards. So when you see someone at Micron that's an engineer, they're an engineer. They have the certifications to be an engineer. They've taken the appropriate classes. They're held to the same standards as everyone else. We're not in the business of doing charity work in this sense, right? So I think having that conversation, and I purposely allow those questions to be asked. So when we have town halls and we talk about diversity and those questions come up, we don't ignore them. We answer those questions because we want to have that conversation. I think the other thing that's important about communications, and one of the first things that I did when I came into Micron, was really defining for us what diversity, equality, and inclusion means at Micron, right? So I was very clear. It's not just synonymous with gender. Everyone has different diversity dimensions, and let's talk about it. And I think that is very powerful. I strongly feel that every executive should have a diversity narrative. So there is some element of diversity that they can tap into and share. They've been an ally in some way, or maybe there's a moment that they're not proud of where they weren't an ally and now they've learned how to speak up. I think it's important to get our leaders talking about that. And if they don't have a diversity story, I would ask them why. Right? Why aren't you tuned in here? But I think that's very powerful for team members to see. And that's one of the reasons I love sharing about my grandmother, because it opens it up for others, right? So now you know in your organization, this is a safe place where you can have a conversation about diversity. And if I was going to start anywhere, I wouldn't start by just looking at the numbers of who we're hiring. I would start with making sure that the culture is accepting of diverse people. I think that if you hire a bunch of folks that are diverse, but your organization isn't inclusive, those people aren't going to stay and you're going to be spinning your wheels. We like to say in HR, you can't out hire bad retention. So you can bring them in, but if you can't keep them, you're just spinning your wheels. So I would say, if I could give any advice on this call, start the conversation. And you can start the conversation with something as simple as a video. So Procter & Gamble has some amazing commercials that touch on diversity issues and racial issues or gender equality. And you could start by simply showing that video and talking about why this is important, or asking what opportunities do you all see in our company that we should be focused on. That's where we started, was with the conversation.
Great feedback. Because I do think that is where it starts, is that we have to be able to look at our landscape, own it, right? Because I do think that Idaho overall has a desire to become more diverse. I believe that the desire is there within a lot of organizations, but I think just having those tools of where do you start and how do you make it work long term. But I loved your example about your mom. I think that was really a great visual of that we all have those dimensions.
Yes. And it's so funny. Earlier this week, we did a free training for some police in Utah, and some of the city council where one of our sites is in Utah. And I shared that story, and instantly someone else shared, oh, I have a son and he has some developmental issues and I'm struggling with that. So when I share my story, it really opens it up for everyone else to say, hey, I'm not alone here. Oh my gosh, I'm struggling with something too, or I'm trying to figure out how to balance work and this thing I have going on, or I want to share something fantastic that my son did this week, even with his challenges, right? And so I think that's what it's about, is starting that dialogue and seeing us as whole humans that have all these different dimensions to us.
Sharawn, as you're describing that interaction with the police in Utah, it's interesting training, by the way. Something comes up that you said earlier, that 45% of white males hide at work. I'm scratching at the surface here of something bigger I sense, and that is, you said it earlier. Can I show up to work and be who I am? And am I going to be accepted? The fear-based version of that question is, can I show up to work, be who I am, and is that going to be held against me? So there is, a bit of this imposter syndrome, because, I am guilty of this too at work, where, there might be things about us personally, about our lives that we're uncomfortable talking about. We think it's baggage. The employer may look at that and, figure 10 ways this could go south. But then you come out and you lower everyone's defensive walls by lowering your wall first. And so on that note, this was a wide swing to come to the question. You opened this call with your DE&I profile. I personally had never heard anyone do that. Not even open. I've never heard anyone get up and say, this is my profile. Is that practice something that's done at Micron? Did you bring that to Micron? Would you encourage others to do that? And is there a right setting? Is there a wrong setting? I just wrote that down when you did that earlier. So
you know what I say? So I would encourage our leaders and our team members to do that, because I think you get a real sense of who I am, right? So when I shared my background, I purposely didn't talk about, college and training. I wanted you all to understand who I am. And that helps you understand how I'm going to show up on this call today. So I do encourage others to share some aspects of your diversity dimensions when you feel it's appropriate. And that's always what I tell people, because they say, gosh, well, I don't want to share all of that. Well, you don't have to. If you don't want to talk about, the motorcycle ride you took last week, that's fine. But maybe you want to share what you did on Sunday with your kids. So you get to dictate how much and when you share your diversity dimensions. But I do think that's what creates authentic relationships and psychological safety, which is the foundation of inclusion. If people don't feel safe in your organization, you're not going to have that inclusive environment. So I think that's what it allows us to do. Now, I will tell you, I mentioned I was raised by my father. my father taught me growing up, hey, when you get to work, they don't need to know who you are. They don't need to know what you're doing. You're there to do a job. You get in, you do your job, and you go home. What I've learned over time, even though my father had the best intentions, is that's probably the worst piece of advice he could have given me, because what happened is people didn't know me, right? So when they're talking about promotion assignments, they don't know that I'm interested in being a people leader, or that I love talking to people, or that I'm teaching at San Jose State University. They don't know those things, right? They don't know that I've always wanted to live in Italy, and now there's a rotation assignment there, but I'm not on their radar. Right. So, or they don't know that I have Nana at home. So maybe I can't get on the call at 8 p.m. So I think sharing who you are opens up new opportunities. And that is my fear, is that when we don't connect in that way at work, people don't have a true understanding of who you are and where you want to go. And I would hate for anyone to miss an opportunity because they're covering.
And as I hear you say, you're placing that responsibility on leaders to create that safe environment, to
Absolutely.
ensure inclusivity is baked into the culture. Because, I also did make that connection that you can hire all the diverse talent that you want, but if you don't have a culture, a landing place that is inclusive and allows them to unfold in a productive way, you're basically wasting your time.
Yeah, actually, that was one of the lessons learned that Intel shared with me. So we do a lot of benchmarking, and they say, when we first started on our journey, we brought in a lot of diverse talent, but we hadn't focused on the environment. And so we lost some of that talent. And so that's why I think if you're going to start somewhere, start with the team members you have. Look at your turnover numbers. Who's leaving? Right? Are your turnover percentages for underrepresented groups, are they in line with the majority population? Are they higher? Are they lower? We look at our ERG members, their retention is higher than our average team members. So I think that tells you something about your environment.
I think it's a both and. I think as leaders, we have a responsibility to have those conversations and actually live it and not just speak it. My mom used to say that everybody's got stuff, just some stuff you can see on the outside and some you can't. But Susie Rios, I say that she's on this call, and she's our statewide outreach director. And I remember once when she told me that she's taught her daughters growing up that they have to learn to have a voice and ask. And I think that that's one of the things too, because that's the other part of both and is, how do you encourage people to not be afraid to speak up, or to ask, or to apply for a job?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
as a leader, you can put out job applications, and I've talked to a lot of our corporate leaders in the Treasure Valley, and they're not getting the applications. But I think you hit on that earlier, that we have to become more intentional and just work a little harder to find the right talent for the organization. So I think it's both and.
Totally agree.
Yeah, one thing that is crystallizing here, Sharawn, I rarely talk to folks at Micron, let alone vice presidents or executive vice presidents, that mention other companies in their talks.
Mm-hmm.
I'm putting competitors aside, but you mentioned Intel, you mentioned Procter and Gamble, you mentioned that you performed some training for police in Utah, and so I'm going to make this up, but talk to me about this. To me, it seems like DE&I is a fairly new field, and I do air quotes because it's probably not new, it's probably just newer to me. And so I also hear that you lean on partners in the industry, or how does that work? I mean, is there a consortium building around this? And as you answer that, I want to distill out of that what we can do in our community here, what the role is of private industry, what the role is of our city and our state government, and nonprofits like Trailhead and the Idaho Women's Business Center.
Yeah, so I would let's start with what our role is. So I think corporations, big, small, medium, they have a role here. We can be a catalyst for change. And you're right, DEI, some companies have been working on it for many, many years. Other companies, such as Micron, within the last 3 years, we've started to be very strategic around it. So we've always had some tactical activities, but now we have a strategy and a roadmap. But one of the things we committed to at Micron is this is for the greater good of everyone. So we want to share the work that we're doing for others to leverage. And many companies feel this way. So I mentioned Intel. We will share with Intel. Intel will share with us. Same with Western Digital. Now, I want to be clear, we don't share any proprietary information, right? But when it comes to DEI, there's certainly things where we can leverage the help of others. And I will say, no one should be in it doing this work alone. So there's fantastic DEI roundtables. PricewaterhouseCoopers, they have a CEO action commitment where CEOs can sign a pledge that they're committed to diversity and inclusion. And they also host a DEI roundtable where many DEI leaders, such as myself, we meet every Friday and we share what we're doing so that we can learn from each other. At Micron, I open source all of our content. So that means if we conduct a DEI training and you all want a copy of that training, we'll share it with you. And we feel that our responsibility around DEI extends far beyond the four walls of our company. So we want to make sure not only do our team members feel seen, heard, valued, respected when they're in Micron, but we want to make sure that they have the basic human rights and they feel a part of their communities, right, where they live, work, and play, because we can't attract them to Micron if they don't feel included when they walk out the door in Idaho. So that's why we're training the police, because we saw that there was a gap and that they didn't have DEI training. We have training. So we want to share it with you all because particularly after the George Floyd incident, we reached out to our local police departments to say, hey, we have some concerns. Our Black team members, we want to have a conversation with you. We want to foster this relationship, but we also want to make sure that our team members are safe, right? So what is it that we can share? And that's not just from a DEI perspective. We also talk to them about their data, because that's what we do, data, right? So are you keeping track of who you're pulling over and and why? Can we see that data? Can we help you to store that data? Do you need help analyzing that data so that our team members have basic human rights? That's important to us. So I would say, as you're thinking about this, don't just think about your team members, and maybe that's where you start, but how can you impact your communities? How can you be a market influencer? How can you share and learn from other companies? And what's so nice is because this space is new for a lot of companies, there is a lot of sharing of best practices. And Micron, we certainly want to be a part of that. And that's why I'm on this call today.
Yeah, I gotta say, having Micron assume the role of a corporate citizen and approach this somewhat sensitive subject of DE&I in the way they have, bringing to bear the power of the resources that Micron has, but also technology. I really appreciate how you just contextualized, what Micron also brings to the table, the data, right? Mm-hmm. And mining that data, analyzing that data, and then using that data to lead to good decisions. And at this point, we got our first question from the audience, and at Survive to Thrive, we're really happy when the audience asks questions. Two things: it means they're awake and they're engaged. That's good. So a question here from Ava Horn, question for Sharawn, and I'm just going to read it out loud. Mm-hmm. Some people have expressed wanting to change the sequence of the letters or words in DEI, i.e. change to EDI. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Thank you for asking this question, because there's EDI, there's inclusion and diversity, there's belonging, right? Someone in my organization said we need to add belonging in. And what I will say, and I don't know if this is a popular answer, call it what you want to. I think they're all important. You've got to have equality. So you look at Salesforce, their program is called Equality, right? I think that's fantastic. That's what we're all striving for. So see what fits for your organization. I don't think there's a right answer, except that you need to start doing the work. So I think you have some flexibility. I do think you need to focus on equality, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. All of that is important. So that's my advice. Pick a name and get started.
The interdependency of those is I think what the key is, and much less the formality of the name. Next question. We're on a roll with questions here. This is good. Susie is asking, how do we start a DE&I conversation at the workplace? And I'm assuming she may mean as an employee and not necessarily as a leader, because that we covered earlier.
Yes. So, as an employee, I think a fantastic way that you can start the conversation, and one of the things that we did at Micron is through learning. Right. We all need to have a growth mindset. So there's a fantastic book called How to Be an Inclusive Leader. And I love this book because it gives very practical, actionable steps and it talks about how we all can be a leader. You don't have to be a people leader to be a leader. But it also highlights that everyone is on a journey and this learning is continuous. So for example, you may look at me or people do look at me and say, oh, you're a DEI expert, you know everything. No, I do not know everything. So for example, I'm part of the Black community. I know a lot about the Black community, but I don't know a lot about the transgender Black community, right? So I'm constantly having to continuously learn. And so I would say if you can start with that book, it gives you a baseline understanding. So as an employee, maybe you grab a few of your peers and you start a book club, or you read a chapter, or you watch a video from Jennifer Brown and you have a conversation about it. Another thing that you can do is join an employee resource group if your company has them. That is a fantastic way to learn about those groups. Join a group you're not familiar with. Learn how to be an ally. How can you support and get involved? And if your company doesn't have employee resource groups, talk about starting one. Reach out to HR, to your leadership team and say, hey, I think this is needed here. Let's create an inclusive environment.
Yeah, so you recommend people actually take initiative and move the ball forward that way. Question from
Yes.
Molly here. And I think time-wise, maybe we'll make this the last question and then give the two of you the chance for some maybe closing thoughts, unless there is another amazing question that comes in the next 30 seconds. And I'll be the arbiter of that. I'll take that. Molly is asking, this is a good question. She goes, I find myself in a lot of conversations related to microaggressions, something you mentioned earlier, Sharawn, especially in the workplace. How do you address this, or what recommendations do you have for leaders to show up in support of others when these aggressions present during meetings?
Great question.
Molly, I love this question, and I'm going to send you our guide on microaggressions after this call. So I need your information. So for those of you all who may not be familiar with microaggressions, they're little subtleties. They could be comments or actions or signals that are directed towards typically an underrepresented group that are hostile or negative, right? And sometimes it could be based on the tone or the nature and what there's as to what is said. So they seem small, right? Almost like a little paper cut. But over time, when it happens again and again and again, it becomes very painful. And what it does is it breaks down self-esteem, right? It impacts mental health and it impacts performance. And it's really signaling to the individual, you don't belong here. And I'll give you some examples. So if you're a woman and you're going to a technical meeting and you walk in and someone says, are you sure you're in the right room? Or you can take me when I'm flying for business and I fly business class and someone who's working at the airlines comes over and says, are you sure you're in the right line? That's a microaggression, right? I was on a plane a while ago, and a gentleman sat back next to me and he said, oh my gosh, I can't stand when these people bump into you. They have no manners and they're all over Chinatown. And I said, really? That's interesting. Tell me more. And he said, I said, what do you mean by that? Well, I'm not racist or anything. I'm just saying. And I said, well, it sounds like you kind of are, though. So that's an example of how to tackle a microaggression. So I want to be clear. Our role as allies is to help people on their journey get to this conclusion on their own. So we're not here to preach to them. We're not here to judge them. I want to be very clear about that. But we are here to have them stop and pause and think about their unconscious bias and what they're saying or doing that's making a negative impact. And so I can tell you one phrase that works really well for me is tell me more. I want to understand more about what you're saying, because then people will take a step back and think about what they just said. Another thing you can do to tackle microaggressions is you can say, when you say that, let me tell you what's coming up for me. how I'm perceiving it. I don't know if this is your intent, but this is my experience. And sometimes, I don't know about you all, but sometimes when people say things, it's so shocking. You're not even ready to talk about it. You're like, oh my God, did they just say that? Like, I've had so many of those moments in my life. So what you can do is you can circle back to it. So you can say, John, you mentioned something last week, and I have a few more questions about it. So I want to bring it back up. When you asked me to take notes in the meeting, and this has happened to me before, right? I want to understand why you asked me that. There were so many other people in the meeting, all males, but I noticed when we're in the meetings, you always point to me to take notes. What's driving that? I mean, I know I take really good notes, but other than that, I mean, I'm sure Jim does too, right? So start to, poke a little bit, because what happens is people will stop and pause and they'll get it. 9 times out of 10, they'll get it. So just know that you can do that, whether it's the person, whether it's happening to you, but more importantly, if you're the witness of it. Call it out. And as you start to do it, it'll get easier and easier. We have a microaggressions guide, and we've created one for every country that we operate in, because each country has different types, whether it's directed towards race or religion or age sometimes, right? Wow, you're really young to be in this role. You have Instagram? What are you doing on that? So things like that. So we have phrases that we've prepared for our team members that they can use to push back against microaggressions. And then we also tell them, if that isn't working, reach out to your HR business partner or to the DEI team or to your leader, because we will not tolerate microaggressions in our culture.
That was so empowering. I have to tell you,
Yes.
to not face microaggression with counter-aggression, but
Yes.
but to confront it. Don't cower, you confront it. But this is my main takeaway from the whole call, is to help them get to the conclusion on their own.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of diplomacy and being able to do that is probably not as easy, but it's very empowering for the individual to know that there is a way other than meeting the microaggression with their own version of aggression. Because I think that's our tendency as people, is to match intensity, is to match aggression. But what you're saying is that there's a different way. On that note, we're almost out of time, but there's one thing you said, and Diane picked up on it, and I am just too curious to not ask this question. Earlier you said, there was one thing your dad, Sharawn, you shared
Mm-hmm.
a piece of advice your father gave you on, just go to work and don't tell them who you are.
Yep.
A bit about my profile. I'm a war refugee, and I went through similar thinking patterns, right? Don't stand out. Don't call attention to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Especially, and I was raised in Germany, where society is not very favorable to those who do stand out anyways. But what were some other maybe thought patterns or mindsets that you think were potentially holding you back, or you uncovered as opportunities? I'm really trying to empower our audience here with some simple on how-tos.
I think the biggest one for me, and I hope you all don't have this, is imposter syndrome. So even now, today, when I introduce myself, I cringe when I say vice president. I don't know why. It sometimes feels like I'm boasting, or it just feels uncomfortable for me. So a lot of times I'll say I'm Sharawn Connors, and I support the DEI team, because I do support my team. But a friend of mine told me, you need to lean into that, girlfriend. Like you're an executive, claim it. And so I think sometimes we second guess ourselves, or we make assumptions about what other people are thinking. And I would say that's another thing too. So as you're thinking about microaggressions, are you playing a part in that microaggression? So if my colleague is asking me to take notes, but I'm in the meeting and all the men are just nodding and looking, and I'm the only one with my notepad out taking notes like I'm crazy, which women tend to do more than men, by the way. They say don't do that. But am I somehow feeding into that stereotype? So I really have to be intentional about leaning into who I am, where I am, and not have that imposter syndrome. We are all capable, qualified. We should all be in the room. And so I would just say, if you're experiencing that, shake it off. read about it and shake it off and lean into what you have rightfully earned and who you are.
Diane, I want to hear from you on this because I know this is a topic near and dear to your heart.
Well, and I think that one of my biggest takeaways, and we talked about this when we visited yesterday, Sharawn, is that push for progress. It doesn't say tippy toe, it doesn't say think about it, but you said push for progress. And I think about whose role is that? It's all of us. I think every single person has a responsibility to identify where they are in that piece of DE&I and what they can do to improve the culture, the community, just the state that we live in. And, I work with a lot of rural areas in Idaho, and the rural areas are very underserved. So, there's all different levels and layers of inclusion. So, but I think that push for progress, and if we have to be actively engaged in the answers. And so thank you so much for sharing all of those wonderful nuggets for us today.
Thank you all. This was fantastic.
Yeah, thank you again. We're about out of time, and so I just wanted to express my gratitude here for everyone's time, Sharawn, especially yours, and for sharing the stories, for sharing best practices, for helping us enrich our own community here with best practices from your organization and your past life. And with that, as I said, February is DE&I month for Survive to Thrive. Join us next session in about 2 weeks. Nick Miller will be joined by Cody Romero. He's the program manager for the Blue Sky Institute at Boise State, and they will talk about opportunities for local businesses to get involved with DE&I community organizations and help translate their intention into action. And with that, you all have a great rest of your day, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye for now.